marigolds and primroses on some of the grass verges. It had seemed a very long winter, made worse by the knowledge that her mother was dying. But it was good that the sun chose to shine today, bringing back memories of Sunday school at St. Mary's with Emily, the Christmas and Easter services with their parents. In the last 2 years, her mother and father had started to attend church every Sunday. She and Emily had wondered why. They had never seemed particularly religious before. Maybe it was because of the cancer. Perhaps their mum had hoped that having a word with the Almighty each week would help. There were at least 20 vehicles in the car park already, and a few people smiled at her. But Alice didn't stop to speak to anyone. She went straight up to the church to await the hearse and her family. Standing in the spring sunshine, looking out across fields, she felt at peace for the first time in weeks. She knew that the service, the hymns, and the vicar speaking of her mother would make her cry, and it would be hard to watch her father and Emily grieving too. But she was focusing on her mother's last request. "Be glad for me that it's almost over, Alice. I've had my life. Get on with your own now, and tell Ralph and Emily to do the same." The hearse approached, and the remaining people outside the church scuttled inside. The doors of the second car opened, and her family spilled out. Dad looked teary-eyed, as did Emily, whose 3 children, Ruby, Jasmine, and Toby, bounded up to Alice. "We were worried about you," Ruby said. Alice and Emily had recently nicknamed her Miss Sensible. Although she was only 10, she was motherly and very bossy. "I was afraid if I came out to the house you might have left already," Alice said, taking the hands of Ruby and Jasmine to get them to follow the pallbearers into the church. She kissed her father and left Mike, her brother-in-law, to go in with him, Toby, and Emily. The service was sad, but at the same time uplifting. Some of Sally's friends had decorated the church with an abundance of flowers, and it looked so pretty with sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Each of the pew ends had a posy of spring flowers pinned to it, more like a wedding than a funeral. The Reverend Henry Dawes had known Sally well, and managed to bring a little humour into his eulogy by speaking of Sally's enthusiasm for jumble sales. He reminded them of when she'd put on an old lady's pink corset over her clothes and a fancy but battered hat, then kept them on for the whole day. Sally had chosen a poem to be read, and asked that Mike read it, as she knew that neither Ralph nor Alice nor Emily would get through it without crying. It began, "Weep not for me though I have gone. Grieve if you will, but not for long." It was typical of their mother that she wanted them to celebrate her life rather than mourn. In fact, in the past, she'd often joked that she wanted Queen's Killer Queen played at her funeral. They'd laughed with her about it, but once they were planning the service, it didn't seem right. Alice glanced sideways at her father several times, but though his lower lip quivered, he was holding it together, as was Emily. The interment would be the testing time. Alice didn't like the idea of burials, but her mother had been saying for years that that was what she wanted, so it had to be done. Alice and Emily had dressed her themselves in the coral-coloured caftan Sally had loved, and fixed 2 glittery hair slides in her platinum blonde wig. Both daughters had wanted to keep her wig, but they knew that Sally would have been furious if they didn't put it on her, with full makeup and nail varnish that matched the caftan. As she would have said, "One has to keep up standards." She had looked beautiful in her simple white coffin, but then she'd been a beauty as a young woman. Even age and cancer couldn't destroy that. The interment was more painful than the service. Alice was all too aware of the horror on the grandchildren's faces when they saw the deep hole in the ground and realised that was where their beloved granny was bound. For Alice, it was the finality that was shocking. She'd never hear her mum's pealing laugh again, never feel the warmth of her hugs. They hadn't seen eye to eye very often. In fact, they'd had some terrible rows, but they had loved one another. It was only once the roses had been dropped into the grave, the last prayer said, and people had started to move away, that Alice noticed the tall, thin man with a deep tan.